It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
We've got a great show for you today. We recently marked the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima disaster, when poor government oversight and corporate negligence joined forces with a tsunami and created a unique disaster that was both natural and man-made. The immediate impacts of the explosion and meltdown were devastating, but what about the long-term effects? What have cleanup efforts accomplished so far? Is the contamination contained? That's what we'll be asking our first guest today, Peter Bradford, a former member of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And that's just the first part of the show. And the second part, one industry that's gotten a lot of relief from the U.S. government lately is the fossil fuels industry. A recent report from Public Citizen details how dirty energy companies have been dipping, double dipping, and even triple dipping into COVID relief programs since the earliest days of the pandemic. How far did this dirty energy bailout go, and what can we do to mitigate the harm? That's what we'll be asking our second guest today, Alan Zibel, who is one of that report's authors. And if we have time, Ralph will answer some of your listener questions. As always, we will check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, it's been 10 years. How's Fukushima doing? David?
Peter Bradford is a former member of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and teaches and advises on utility regulation, nuclear power, and energy policy in the United States and overseas. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Peter Bradford.
Glad to be back, David.
Welcome indeed, Peter. The Fukushima disaster in northern Japan led to the closing of the many Japanese nuclear reactors, the abandonment and evacuation of tens of thousands of people around those plants. And they're still closed, they're still boiling, they're still pouring radioactive water into the Pacific. It's conceivably the greatest nuclear power plant disaster ever, perhaps challenged only by the Chernobyl disaster in the Ukraine. The 10th anniversary is a time to evaluate nuclear power. What do you think the lessons learned and unlearned from Fukushima here in this country?
Boy, there's a lot of them. For one thing, the Fukushima accident shows one of the many reasons why nuclear power is such a poor bet when it comes to combating climate change. Look what happened in the space of 3 or 4 days during which the Fukushima complex self-destructed. 3 different reactors melted down. But a significant percentage, between 10 and 20% of the world's nuclear capacity was taken offline as a result of that, and nuclear construction programs came to a halt around the world. There's no remotely comparable event that could affect other low-carbon sources like energy efficiency or renewables. They don't have this interdependent vulnerability that nuclear power has. And of course, on top of that, we've seen that the liability limits in the U.S. and elsewhere are frivolous compared to the actual costs of a major nuclear accident. I mean, U.S. law limits the liability for nuclear accidents to in the neighborhood of $13 billion. The latest estimates for the cost of Fukushima are now $180 billion and counting. I mean, I don't doubt that the ultimate costs, when everything is taken into account of that accident, will be $1 trillion or more.
And what would have happened, Peter, if the wind shifted toward Tokyo instead of out to the ocean right after that meltdown?
It would have been a much more serious event even than it was. About the only break the Japanese caught during those days when they were afflicted with the earthquake and then the tsunami and then the nuclear accidents was that the wind consistently blew out to sea. I think roughly 80% of the radiation from the accident was blown out over the Pacific. Had the winds been toward Tokyo, had they had to consider evacuating the populations involved in an overland radiation path ending at Tokyo. There's no doubt that the death toll would have been considerably higher. You just can't evacuate a region like Tokyo without casualties resulting not necessarily from the radiation, but just from the evacuation process.
38 million people live there.
Yeah, exactly. And the property damage in terms of contamination and land to which people couldn't return would have been far, far higher. I mean, of the 100 and some thousand people who evacuated around Fukushima at the time, I don't know, half or more had not been able to return to their homes even today. If that were true of the much greater populations.
It resulted in the closing of 54 of Japan's nuclear plants all over the country. What's the situation now? Have they been reopened?
Very few, a handful, are back online. Some are permanently closed. Some are in what the Japanese consider extended shutdown, but I think most people assume that they won't open. And a few are in a kind of negotiation that goes on in Japan between the local authorities and the national government and the nuclear industry. And it's anybody's guess whether they'll reopen or not.
We're talking with Peter Bradford, former Nuclear Regulatory Commission commissioner, among other posts he's held. You pointed out that the impact of Fukushima led to decisions to exit nuclear power in Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, and Taiwan. What did it do in this country where nuclear power has come to an almost total stop in terms of new construction, except in Georgia?
Well, it's interesting, but the U.S. has 20-some reactors of the Fukushima type in operation. So the safety significance of that accident for the U.S., not that all of them are likely to be afflicted by a tsunami, but in terms of possible failures of off-site power, were pretty significant. And our Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff set out to prepare a paper on the lessons that should be learned. But a couple of their major recommendations would have been quite expensive for the industry. And the commissioners of the NRC in the end decided not to adopt them. And that's because nuclear power is under so much economic pressure now. It just can't compete in today's power markets. It's desperately seeking subsidies in all parts of the U.S. where there are markets. It's corrupted the political process in Illinois and Ohio, and people are literally under investigation, under indictment. In South Carolina, they've pleaded guilty. So nuclear power is the economic trouble that it's in, which is partly Fukushima related, but also just has to do with the inherent high cost.
It can't compete with natural gas. It can't compete with renewables now. Wind power, solar panels are going down very fast in cost. And it's essentially liquidating, isn't it? I mean, more plants are closing down, and the desperate effort by the industries to get the American taxpayer in Washington to subsidize renewal of the license for another 40 years for some of the remaining plants. Can you give us some of the figures here?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. We had, at the time of the Fukushima accident, 104 operating reactors in the U.S. We have 94 now, and more than that would have closed if the industry hadn't hornswoggled state officials in Illinois and Ohio and New Jersey into propping them up with subsidies paid for by the customers. The industry is completely dependent on federal taxpayer largesse for any hopes of building any more plants, and they don't have any hopes of building any more for at least a decade, and probably longer than that. The two plants in Georgia, again, are completely dependent on the customers paying 3 or 4 times the cost of getting the same energy in other ways, including other low carbon ways. I mean, you listed some, but you could add energy efficiency and storage combined with grid management to that list. And you can create a 24-hour low carbon or zero carbon energy system at a significantly smaller cost than relying on nuclear power. And you can do it much sooner. I mean, those are shovel-ready technologies. New nuclear is, at best, a decade, much more likely 2 or 3 decades in the future, and too expensive even then.
The hypocrisy of these Republican states is striking. Florida, Georgia, South Carolina had these plants under construction They had the state government and the federal government coerce ratepayers to continually bail out the huge cost overruns. We're talking maybe 100%, 200% cost overruns, years in delay. They finally abandoned them in Florida, I think in South Carolina. But in Georgia, they're demanding the federal government add more billions of dollars, which they have, to the still under construction Georgia nuclear plants. And then they turn around and attack Democrats in elections being socialists. So when do you think, Peter, the environmental groups and people like Bill Gates will stop including nuclear power in the overall mix of the future energy technologies?
Based on their performance over the last 30, 40 years, you'd have to say never. But, Republicans do profess a faith in markets, and nuclear power has yet to bid a single kilowatt hour successfully in a power market anywhere in the world. So you'd think eventually that would, it has sunk in at times. I mean, there have been market-oriented Republicans who've said this is too much. David Stockman, for example, when he was director of the budget under Ronald Reagan, threw in the towel on nuclear power and said it was contrary to Republican budgetary principles. So honest Republicans, yeah, there are plenty of them who take one look at these results and walk away from it.
And then there are the major environmental groups who won't come down hard on nuclear power. And Bill Gates' new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, indicates his faith in new, smaller nuclear plants, which he's invested in. And yet you have people like Stanford's Mark Jacobson, whose team calculated recently that about every country in the world can go to 80% renewable energy by 2030, which is just 9 years from now. What is holding up the major environmental groups from basically closing down on nuclear power as an option?
Boy, it's a sort of faith-based energy policy. Nuclear power has been in the position of saying, yes, we've screwed up to now, but we have a new technology that's just around the corner that'll be brighter and shinier and cheaper and safer. And then another 5 or 10 years go by and that technology fails also. I'm afraid these groups don't have much historical memory, and they sure have a infinite capacity of putting hope and faith on nuclear power. It's not just Mark Jacobson either. For God's sakes, Amory Lovins' seminal piece was back in 1976. Dave Freeman did a paper before that said that nuclear was not going to be a productive answer for the U.S. Arjun Makhijani has published, Mark Cooper's published. There's a slew of studies that anyone who takes a serious interest in these things can look at.
Well, it could be that it'll take another, heaven forbid, disaster, say in the nuclear plants at Indian Point before they close down, just 30 miles north of Manhattan, New York City, is exposed to a potential earthquake risk. Isn't that true?
Well, yes. I mean, I think it is high time that the Indian Point plants did close, and they are closing quite soon now. But there are other plants that were not really cited with today's standards in mind. The overall nuclear safety record is not what would have gotten from renewables and efficiency-based world. It's arguably better than coal and other fossil fuels, but there's just no reason to keep running those risks given the low carbon potential of a whole basketful of other technologies that we have available now.
I thought Amory Lovin's argument was the most conclusive. He said, take all the money that's being invested in these nuclear plants, put it in renewable energy conservation efficiency. You'll get far more megawatts, far safer, far longer enduring, and far more community-based, without the risks of a nuclear power plant disaster here and there.
Yeah, and much sooner also. I mean, for all the talk of a nuclear renaissance that began 10 years before Fukushima under the Bush-Cheney energy plan, we have not saved a single molecule of carbon with a new nuclear plant in the U.S. in the 21st century. and we've spent billions of dollars trying. If that same money had gone into efficiency and renewables, we'd be far, far ahead of where we are.
And as you say, far quicker, because a nuclear plant is taking anywhere from 10 to 15 years just to be built.
Or in our case, 10 or 15 years to put $9 billion in a hole in the ground and then cancel.
Right. Is there anything else before we conclude you'd like to say?
Well, just to reiterate that the idea that nuclear energy is somehow our best answer to climate change, it's the industry's only real justification for its ongoing subsidy quest, but it's really is completely contrary to nuclear power's 40 years of failure to deliver on its promises.
By the way, just one point I forgot to ask you. The Fukushima plants are recirculating water, and it's very contaminated, and they're dumping it regularly in the Pacific Ocean. What does that do to the fisheries, and how far has it gone toward the U.S. coast?
As far as I know, the very slight traces that have reached the U.S. coast are not a health and safety issue for us. It's very much an issue in Japan, where seafood products, fish, seaweed, from the area around Fukushima, most people still won't eat, and I think at least some of those products are actually banned from Japanese markets.
I'm going to jump in here because Peter Bradford's cell phone just faded on us, and the last point he makes is very important. What he said was, quote, "It's very much an issue in Japan and seafood products for people who fish in the area around Fukushima. Most people still won't eat it, and I think many of those products are banned from Japanese markets," unquote.
Thank you very much, Peter. To be continued.
Okay, Ralph.
We'll be in touch.
Good talking with you again.
We've been speaking with Peter Bradford. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, big oil? Gaming the system? Well, I never. We'll get to that after we check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, March 19, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. In a new book, The Monsanto Papers, Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice, Carrie Gillum tells the story of Lee Johnson's landmark lawsuit against Monsanto after a workplace accident left Johnson doused in Monsanto's herbicide and facing a deadly cancer. Johnson was the first to take Monsanto to trial, drawing attention from around the world as his case became one of the most dramatic legal battles in courthouse history. There was a unanimous jury verdict after 6 weeks of trial. All the jurors voted that the Monsanto weed killer did cause cancer and did cause Lee Johnson's cancer, Gillum said. They found that Monsanto engaged in egregious misconduct by trying to hide the risks. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. You know, Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire declared that she always depended on the kindness of strangers. Well, it turns out that the oil industry, which by this time you'd think would be fairly well established as a private enterprise, still depends on the kindness of taxpayers. David?
Alan Zibel is a journalist and the research director of Public Citizen's Corporate Presidency Project, which focuses on corporate influence and conflicts of interest in the Trump administration. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Alan Zibel.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome indeed. This can be considered part of a series of giant corporate capitalism desperately seeking socialism. And in your article, you start out saying, when the financial crisis struck in 2008, Wall Street got bailed out while Main Street got left behind. Banking industry titans received billions in government bailouts while millions of homeowners lost their homes to foreclosures that federal assistance programs failed to prevent, end quote. And you've just written an article for the Public Citizen newspaper, which all members of Public Citizen get, about what the Federal Reserve is up to again. The New York Times seems to be clueless on this. They keep writing articles about the chairman of the Federal Reserve wanting to create jobs and to deal with incentives for companies to moderate their assault on greenhouse gas emissions, to moderate their emissions of greenhouse gases, and they don't seem to make the point you make in this article, that the Federal Reserve is actually subsidizing these fossil fuel giants. Can you explain?
Sure. So, last spring when the coronavirus crisis happened, we almost had the Fed's telling we almost had a market panic, and the Fed stepped in and injected a huge amount of money into the financial system and kept bond markets and stock markets from collapsing. And I think most people would say, okay, it's good that we didn't have a gigantic financial meltdown. I think that's relatively uncontroversial-ish, but the Fed really went very, very far and took unprecedented steps to do something they'd never done before, which was to buy corporate debt. And by buying corporate debt, they essentially, including junk bonds, which is really, the lowest low-rated, high-interest rate corporate debt. And when they did that, they essentially put a floor under all the debt markets. They bought tons of debt, and as a result, all corporate debt issuers had a banner year last year, refinanced their bad debt at much lower rates. Corporate debt issuance went through the roof. And that in particular benefited the sectors of the economy that were doing the worst, right? So the oil industry last year was in terrible shape, tons of bankruptcies that are still going on, the U.S. fracking industry. And that's really because, the problems preceded COVID, but they were worsened by COVID for that industry. Oil prices plummeted. They couldn't make any money anymore. So they started going bankrupt. And so what you had was the Fed policy by purchasing corporate debt. They kind of greased the wheels for corporate debt issuance and allowed, fostered a lot of industry consolidation and, gave kind of a new lifeline to this industry that does so much damage to the planet, as we all know. So what the Fed did last spring, and whether it was overkill, is going to be debated for a long, long time. I think you're right that the mainstream narrative by my former colleagues in the media has been very pro-Jay Powell. And I think, we're starting to see some questioning. We should be seeing some questioning of whether they went overboard.
Give us an idea of the scale here in money terms. Billions of dollars, tens of billions of corporate bonds or corporate debt?
Yeah, so we counted, but when we did a report last September, we worked with Friends of the Earth and a group called Bailout Watch, and we were able to count $100 billion in new debt issuance from the start of the bailouts last March until the time we issued the report. So that's a huge amount of debt. And the important thing to know is that the Fed didn't buy that debt themselves, right? They bought some debt from energy companies themselves, but they didn't really, that's not kind of the important thing. Like just by buying a little bit of debt, they kind of put a floor under the whole market and were the buyer of last resort, giving confidence to the entire corporate debt market, essentially. The Fed would always be there, kind of, no matter how bad your business model is, if you can sell debt on public debt markets, the Fed's got your back. So, you mentioned socialism and capital. I'm not sure that qualifies as capitalism. If you're
that's why I say corporate capitalism, which
right.
is really a form of corporate socialism. Chairman Jerome Powell has been getting good publicity because the Fed is tiptoeing into this area known as giving disincentives to companies that emit greenhouse gases or providing incentives for companies who reduce them. And I thought your article brought Chairman Powell down to earth in terms of what the Federal Reserve is really doing. And you quote in your article, Martin Midstream, a gas pipeline operator, raised nearly $400 million as part of a debt restructuring designed to avoid seeking bankruptcy protection. 2 weeks later, it awarded 3 top executives retention bonuses of $100,000 each. So is there any congressional inquiry here? Anybody following up? What kind of reaction did you get to your article?
So not that we've heard. There's been some oversight efforts looking into the bailouts last year when Trump was president. Haven't heard much about that lately. But I do think that there should be some progressive discussion about the Fed, right? I think, Jay Powell gets some credit for standing up to Trump and not being a toady of Trump like the rest of the Trump administration, but that only gets you so far, right? Like, I mean, we should be more than just not a Trump toady. I mean, yeah.
As Robert Weissman, President Public Citizen, said, quote, "Big oil didn't just get a bailout, it got a lifeline to keep burning fossil fuels with impunity, pushing us closer to unfixable global warming. It makes no sense that the Federal Reserve would keep fueling climate catastrophe," end quote. Did Public Citizen take your article and convert it into an open letter or a demand directly addressed to Chairman Powell? Take it to the next stage, so to speak?
So we actually have a bunch of stuff that's going on in climate financial regulation. We're launching a whole new kind of program to push the Fed to consider issues of climate in financial regulation, both in the bailouts, which are kind of old news at this point, but in future financial regulation rulemakings. Jay Powell has been pretty terrible on bank regulation. He's been very deferential to the industry. So that's all the info you need to not reappoint him as Fed chair. But, the Fed has been moving very, very slowly on integrating climate into their regulatory policies. And they're finally getting there, though.
Ellen, did any press pick this up? Were you interviewed on NPR, PBS, the other commercial stations, noted in newspapers? I'm always interested in that.
We did get some press on this one. It was not huge, but we did get some press.
Because it's not just an article, it's a report. How can people get the Public Citizen report?
Yes, they can get it by going to citizen.org/research, and it's right on there.
Thank you very much. We've been talking with Alan Zibel, Public Citizen, former reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So he's had quite a bit of familiarity with corporate and government intricacies. Before we close, Alan, I just ask Steve or David, any comments or questions? David, Steve?
Yeah, Alan, I guess what amazes me is that the fossil fuel industry is, and I kind of hinted at this in the opening, is so well established. It is so, 150 years old that they would still be putting their hand out to the government for subsidies. Seems like the public should be truly outraged by this.
Indeed. And I mean, this is an industry that's extremely subsidized. There was another thing that we've noted in our reports on this is the fact that there was a tax giveaway to the fossil fuel industry that McConnell and his allies put in the CARES Act last year. I mean, they're making out like bandits from these rescues in ways that the public is just not paying attention to. Now, there is some hope lately. Under Biden, the Interior Department is going to freeze new oil drilling on federal lands and offshore waters and is going to review royalties that fossil fuel companies are required to pay for drilling in those areas. And those are, public interest groups for many, many years have called those out as way too low. There is some positive progress on that, but there's no question it's an extremely subsidized industry.
I'd like to circle back to something you were talking about earlier. Climate change notwithstanding, and not looking at the oil industry as murdering our planet, can they survive without subsidies?
Right. It's a great question. Or you might refine the question a bit and say, can the U.S. oil industry survive without subsidies? I mean, the Saudis can probably survive for a while longer, but, we produce oil and gas in the U.S. in the most expensive way possible. So, when fracking, in addition to all its environmental damage, is very, very expensive and it only makes economic sense above a certain price. So that's why they fight so hard on subsidies is they hit a point where they just, it doesn't make any economic sense to drill. And then they've got to close down their rigs in Texas and New Mexico and Colorado and such.
But if you were to go back, look at the past 50 years at ExxonMobil, had they not had subsidies, the oil industry is lousy with boom and bust cycles.
Right,
so would ExxonMobil have survived? I don't think they had a particularly good year last year.
A terrible year. So the majors have had awful years. And they're international oil giants, so they can survive. They've got, assets all over the globe. But the ones that are going under are, sort of the domestic only producers going bankrupt all over the place. Now, we've had a bump in oil prices over the past couple of weeks, but I don't think that with the advent of electric cars and the movement toward renewables, it's just hard to see projects like drilling in Alaska, making any economic sense, let alone, obviously, it doesn't make any environmental sense, but yeah.
Alan, that was proven because the auction a few weeks ago, the main bidder was the state of Alaska. It was considered so unprofitable to bid for new tracts of land for drilling.
Right. And so, the economics of that may make that impossible, which is a good thing, I would say.
Alan, one last question before we let you go, and no problem if you don't know the answer to this. How do the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry compare to subsidies we give to the renewable fuel industry?
I mean, all I can say in that is that they're much lower. I mean, there's the wind production tax credit that I believe just got renewed. I believe there's some solar credits, but I think it doesn't even rate. I mean, the oil industry is massively subsidized.
So it kind of pales in comparison, you'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a little bit uncomfortable because I haven't studied that directly. But
not only that, Steve, but the solar industry subsidies have expiration dates.
Right.
Sunsets, ironically enough.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Well, we've been talking with Alan Zibel of Public Citizen. The report came out on how the Fed, by buying up the corporate debt of fossil fuel companies, is subsidizing these companies and therefore facilitating the continued emission of deadly greenhouse gases that are fueling the climate crisis and violent climate change in this country. Thank you very much, Alan.
Okay, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, you're welcome.
We've been speaking with Alan Zibel. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
So let's do some listener questions. David.
This first question comes to us from Karen Engstrom. She says, Ralph, I wrote letters to the Democratic Party and progressive Democrats urging them to study why the right has taken over the radio airwaves and what the party can do to make a difference for the next congressional election by planning better radio communication. I suggested they read Ann Nelson's book, Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right, that they study the regulations and propose a law similar to the Fairness Doctrine, including radio time for candidates, elections, and community organizations, that all stations must have local news, weather, and other local information every day, that commercial stations pay a fee for their frequencies that would cover a good percentage of funds for public radio and eliminate dependence upon corporate monies. I believe in memberships and donations from the public promote community, but costs have gone up and many public radio stations are suffering. I've CC'd everyone, including my representatives.
Terrific performance, Karen. This is exactly the kind of listener response and action we're looking for. Please let us know whether any of your representatives have written you back. Let us know whether any other people you've written to on this issue have responded, and we'll keep it going in terms of informing our listeners. It's all part of our effort to get listeners to download the letters on corporate crime, on taxing the super rich and the mega corporations. Send the letters to the senators from your state and the representative from your district and demand a response in writing. And then we'll get these members to take positions as the momentum builds up, because these are not letters that can be easily evaded. And you can find these letters on nader.org.
Very good. This next question comes from Bruce Middledorf. He says, the utility executive who spent billions of dollars on 2 South Carolina nuclear plants that never generated a single watt of power pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges on Wednesday. What do you think of that, Ralph?
That's a scandal. A big one that's been going on for a long time. They've stolen a lot of money from ratepayers and the federal taxpayer. And then when they give up on the plant, because it's totally uneconomic, it hasn't been completed, all kinds of other problems with it, technically, no one has to pay back. The utility doesn't have to pay back to the ratepayers. The state of South Carolina that provided cover with the support of Senator Lindsey Graham doesn't have to pay back federal taxpayer. It's another example of corporate immunity, corporate impunity, and the unstoppable, it seems, so far, corporate supremacy over more and more of our political economy. Think what these billions of dollars could have done if they were applied to communities throughout South Carolina to retrofit buildings and homes for more energy efficiency, good jobs, less greenhouse gases, and more money in ordinary people's pocketbooks. This is the true criminogenic nature of corporate power over our government.
This next question comes to us from David Hubler, and it's about citizen journalism. He writes, sometime back, you had a program speaker discussing individuals setting up their own local news services, possibly retired individuals. Sorry, I don't have more detail. I cannot seem to find that podcast in your list. Does this ring a bell? Can you steer me to such an episode? Thank you for all you do, David Hubler, author, illustrator.
David, you might be interested in an article by the media critic of the New York Times, Ben Smith, in March 8th edition, Monday, of the New York Times, where he talks about breakout local news initiatives by younger reporters who quit their jobs and form groups like Detector and other groups and provide freelance and full-time journalism on local matters. So it's starting to happen around the country, including subscription services. So check out Ben Smith's long article on this.
This next question comes from Ray Austin. He says, hi, Ralph, Steve, and David. I really enjoyed the program you're providing. Thank you. For many years, I've been bewildered by the seeming lack of interest in the U.S. about us. I'm referring to Canada. President Biden said the U.S. has no greater friend or ally than Canada. We also combine as an enormous trading bloc. Yet the meeting between him and our liberal, cough, cough, PM, that's his editorial, was muted in terms of press coverage. We are, in fact, generally ignored. What gives? Is it deliberate? Is it disinterest? Are we that boring? Maybe there's something else there. Maybe it is a good thing. Gentlemen, please shine some light on this. It's quite puzzling. Stay the course, and thanks again, your buddy Ray from Victoria, British Columbia.
Well, Ray, here's some light. I had the same response that you had years ago, and so I got together with a couple Canadians, including Duff Conacher and Nadia Milleron from stateside, and we put out a book called Canada First. Because I'd be up there speaking for a Canadian audience, I'd say, where is your country coming in first in science or social welfare or whatever, technology? And they'd come up with maybe 6, 7, 8 examples, and then they'd run out, something you wouldn't experience in Texas if the same question was asked. So we put out this book, Canada First. It was a 43-week bestseller, but only after a lot of Canadian publishers turned it down until McClellan Stewart published it, on the grounds that Canadians are too modest, that they're not interested in a book that touts their extraordinary breakthroughs in science, technology, the arts, media, communications, undersea communications. The first oil well, by the way, was drilled in Canada. The first children's museum was created in Canada, and other innovations. So that occurred in the 1990s. You want to check that book. Then other examples. One reason the U.S. doesn't pay enough attention to Canada is because they don't want to bring to U.S. citizens things that Canadians have that we could have, like full Medicare for all. Everybody in, nobody out, your free choice of doctor and hospital, much saving of lives, aggravation. You don't see reams of computerized billing, and they have better outcomes. And it's more efficient. Comes in at about half the price per capita, and everybody's covered. Unlike the U.S., which is double the price per capita in Canada, and there's still 80 million people in the U.S. either uninsured or underinsured. So they don't like to show this because, it provides powerful arguments for consumer and citizen groups in the U.S. And then the third is that the Canadians don't come down to the U.S. and talk about their country enough. CBC has an office in Washington, D.C., where they relay news about the U.S. to Canada but there just isn't enough Canadian effort. I've often thought some Canadians want to take bus tours through various communities in New England and elsewhere to tell Americans how effective their single payer is. It would not only be a service for U.S. consumers, but also provide a little more legitimate pride for a country that is indeed excessively modest about its social safety net and other advances beyond that of the United States. Canadians actually brought the idea of a credit union to New Hampshire from Quebec about a century or so ago, which now has spread all over the United States with about 70 million members in credit unions. And that's just one example.
Ralph, listener Susan Vaughn asked, can states intervene and pass laws against these Medicare disadvantage plans, since technically they aren't Medicare, a federal program?
Well, since the money for the Medicare disadvantage plans run by Aetna, United Healthcare, and other profiteering insurance companies comes from the federal government, there's a preemption of the states being able to interfere or to regulate that. However, there might be an overlap in terms of deceptive advertising, where state consumer agencies might be able to have an overlapping jurisdiction against the remarkably unenforced deceptive advertising of these companies luring elderly people into these plans.
All right, very good. This comes from listener Gian Pauletto. It says, Dear Ralph Nader Radio Hour, have you considered inviting Bill Gates onto the show to discuss his new book, How to Avoid Climate Disaster? It challenges some of our thoughts about dealing with this problem. For example, like Paul Hawken's Drawdown Project, it doesn't forbid the use of nuclear fission energy, a touchy subject with Ralph Nader and probably some of the show's listeners, but nevertheless, something needing more discussion. So, Ralph, let's discuss. What do you think?
Yeah, we have no problem inviting Bill Gates on the show. We'll send him an invitation, send his publisher an invitation. Unlikely he'll accept it, but it's a good idea. Bill Gates thinks nuclear should be part of the mix, and that's a disaster. Nuclear power is uneconomic, uninsurable, unsecure. Haven't dealt with radioactive waste disposal for hundreds of thousands of years, and in many ways cannot exist without massive infusions of taxpayer subsidy over the 15 years or so it takes to build a nuclear plant. We can't wait that long in the first place, and the same money can produce far more megawatts through solar energy, wind power, and save megawatts by retrofitting buildings and improving transportation fuel efficiency.
And for those of you who want to know even more, refer to our discussion with Peter Bradford, former Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner, who's been following this since the 70s. I happen to notice, Ralph, on CNN after the Texas freeze-out, Arctic freeze, Anderson Cooper on CNN, who has Bill Gates on his show all the time, asked, I think, Beto O'Rourke, who was rightfully denigrating Greg Abbott's response, blaming the Green New Deal, this thing that does not exist. But Anderson Cooper says, well, what about nuclear? And Beto O'Rourke says, well, I think that should be part of the mix. And it just seems like this message has not gotten through to the mainstream media, and celebrities like Bill Gates, who can have a relationship with Anderson Cooper and that platform on CNN, they hold sway.
Well, it could be invincible ignorance on the part of the Democrats, but I doubt it. There's just too much disclosure of how economically disastrous nuclear power plants are, and not to mention that they cannot exist from beginning to end without massive infusions of taxpayer subsidies. And one nuclear plant disaster, like Fukushima or Chernobyl, and you've got potentially an area the size of Pennsylvania radioactively uninhabitable. So do you want to risk that? We want to support a technology whose only purpose is to boil water. There are many other ways to boil water to produce steam without having the risks of uninsurable radioactive disasters occurring because of nuclear power plant failures or exposure to earthquakes or, heaven forbid, even sabotage.
Well, thank you for your questions. Keep them coming in the Ralph Nader Radio Hour inbox. We're going to close the show here by introducing a new feature that is on nader.org. And Ralph, this is things that people who are familiar with the show know that we've talked about, but you started a new section on your website called Reporters Alert. Tell us about what that is and what some of the stories you want to alert reporters who are.
Well, if you can't get through to reporters and editors these days, it's harder than ever in an internet age. I thought we'd propose great stories that are either not covered at all or little covered on a website so that they can come to the website. We can't reach them, but if they know that periodically they can check in with Reporters Alert, they'll find some very, very powerful stories that they have been missing. We're already up to over 15 such stories, and more will be added. If you want to find out what these stories are all about, go to nader.org/reporters-alert. To give you some examples, Steve and David, the Pentagon has still not been audited, violating a 1992 federal statute requiring all federal agencies and departments to present auditable data about their budget to the Government Accountability Office of the U.S. Congress. That's the largest single operating budget in the federal government by far, the Pentagon budget. It needs to be dug into by reporters. 5,000 people a week die because of preventable problems in hospitals in the United States. 5,000 a week, 250,000 a year. Who says so? The Johns Hopkins School of Medicine report in 2016, peer-reviewed, and when it was released, it was a small one-day story. What? 5,000 a week? That really deserves many stories on an ongoing basis. Congress works 3 days a week. Where did that start? Congress is supposed to be paid to work full time. One reason they don't do enough public hearings on the real problems affecting the American people and what these agencies and departments are doing in the executive branch is they don't work Monday and Friday. They fly in Tuesday morning and fly out Thursday afternoon. And in between, they spend quite a few hours going to private nearby offices where they dial for campaign dollars. That's another story.
Yeah, it seems to me like Congress is more like a retirement home. You know, you show up for a few meetings and then the rest is just fun activities.
Very unproductive. If it wasn't for certain requirements, like producing a budget, which is proposed by the executive branch when it's supposed to be proposed by the House of Representatives under the Constitution, their output has been very, very low compared to previous Congresses. How about this? Uncollected taxes are between $400 to $600 billion a year, according to the IRS. But the IRS has had its budget slashed by the Republicans since 2011, aiding and abetting corporate tax evasion. So they don't have the auditors to do the audits of these complex global corporations or super wealthy people. And the budget now is so strained that it takes days just for people to get through on the phone to the IRS to ask pressing questions about their own personal tax obligations. That is something that is now on the backs of the Democrats. And a big story is, why does Chairman Richard Neal of the House Ways and Means Committee not expanding the IRS budget? He comes from progressive Western Massachusetts, and there's no heat on him to do something different than what his predecessor Republican chair did, to starve the IRS. How about this? Billing fraud in the healthcare industry alone is about $1 billion a day. A day, $1 billion. Who says so? Well, the usual conventional estimate is 10% of all healthcare expenditures go down the drain in this fashion. A lot of corporate crime here. $60 billion is taken from Medicare alone every year by corporate billing, fraud, and abuse. And the 10% figure has been documented by the leading expert, the applied mathematician at Harvard, Professor Malcolm Sparrow, who says to me months ago, that's the lowest figure he would estimate. It could be much higher. So that's $350 billion a year. That's about half the Pentagon budget. And it's not even a news story. It's not even an issue for political candidates running for congressional or White House offices year after year. It just goes on. And I think we've said enough now, other than to abbreviate. You hear about all these sanctions on foreign governments, foreign potentates, foreign groups that the White House doesn't like. Who enforces these sanctions? Are they all legal? What happens if they fall on millions of innocent people like Iranians? They can't get adequate medicines or adequate medical catheters and other things that are prescribed. That's not even talked about. So we have a lot of good stories right across the board for any number of reporters, big media, small media, independent media, to dig into. And we're not waiting to get our calls back from these reporters and editors. You can now come to us at nader.org/reporters-alert.
Ralph, tell me how it's different from when your career first started in the late 60s through the 70s. Is it harder to get a reporter's attention these days?
Tremendously harder. You used to be able to call a reporter. They would be at their typewriter, at their desk. They wouldn't have to post all kinds of news at 11, 1, 3, the way they do now on the internet. They have to meet a certain deadline, maybe 5, 6 o'clock for the next day's newspapers. They'd pick up the phone and you'd have an exchange back and forth. Email doesn't do it. It's too cluttered. You often don't get responded to. It's filtered out, whatever. You can't get reporters on the phone with a few exceptions. I would say 10% of the reporters still do it the old-fashioned way, like David Farenthal of the Washington Post. And I asked him, David, why do you pick up your phone when most of your colleagues don't? He says, that's how I get my stories. I said, that's so obvious that years ago it wouldn't have been uttered by a reporter. Editors are even more difficult. Yet when you get them, they say, oh, thank you for calling. Call us anytime. Yeah, day after day trying to get through. Who has the time?
Can our listeners help here? Can they take action? Can they go to nader.org, go to Reporters Alert, find a story that seems to relate to them or interest them, and ding their local reporters?
Great suggestion. In fact, here's one for people in New York State. Governor Cuomo has said there's going to be a $16 billion state deficit with negative effects on education, mass transit, healthcare, you name it. It just so happens that New York State, since 1982, has collected and rebated a sales tax on stock transactions at the level of $350 billion, estimated by Jim Henry, former economist for McKinsey, who's leading the fight to get the state just to keep what it rebates. And last year, what it rebated was about what the state deficit is going to be this year. We're talking $14 to $16 billion. Now, the listeners to this program, especially if they get up early enough on WBAI in New York City, can call the local press and say, hey, why aren't you covering this story? You can't be afraid of Wall Street and the brokers. This is a fraction of 1% sales tax when we have to go into stores in New York and pay 8% sales tax for the necessities of life. Come on. Fulfill the people's right to know. Write an article, write a feature, interview the assembly people and the state senators who are supporting the retention of this rebate, but can't get Governor Cuomo to respond favorably.
Would you invite our listeners to suggest stories themselves that you can put on the Reporters Alert?
We can do that if it covers corporate power and government surrender. That's sort of the area that we're focusing on right now. Obviously, the potential list of local, state, regional, national, international is endless, but we'd like hot stories that aren't covered dealing with corporate crime, fraud, abuse, and government non-regulation, government complicity, government non-response.
Well, there you have it, people. Go to nader.org, click on Reporters Alert. You'll see suggestions of stories there, and call your local reporters, have them take action, have them start reporting on this stuff. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want to thank our guests again, Peter Bradford, Alan Zibel. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has provided 2 separate form letters to send to your representatives demanding they take action on corporate crime and taxing the rich. Just click on the clearly marked boxes on the right-hand corner of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website, and it's all laid out there for you to fill in and personalize any way you want. Go to ralphnaderradiohour.com and take action.
And to support the American Museum of Tort Law, check out their online shop at store.tortmuseum.org. They have autographed books, flaming Pinto coffee mugs, and other unique gifts for all you lawyers, law students, paralegals, and tort fans out there.
And for an independent news source that believes people are more important than corporations, go to populist.com to read or subscribe to The Progressive Populist.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we'll be joined by Stephen Donziger, a man who took on Chevron and is now a corporate political prisoner. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And as Steve said, those letters are designed to make you have a bigger impact on Congress. They can't fluff those letters off. They're too detailed. So go with the corporate crime letter to get corporate crime hearings and federal corporate crime reform.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up, where Ralph answers a listener question.
So let's do some listener questions. David?
This one comes to us from Anthony. He writes, the show's fantastic 2017 episode on the ethical failure of business schools deserves an encore. How about Stephen Kahn's 2019 book? Without having seen it or heard the author, 2 questions come immediately to mind. Number 1, how to win over those with rather blinkered conceptions of the possibilities of capitalism. What about our unreconstructed business school grads circa 1999? They and their cohorts will be the business leaders over the next 15 to 20 years. And number 2, is anyone proposing alternative business schools that emphasize environmental sustainability, higher worker wages, etc.? There's too much greenwashing, and we see the coalition pushing back against living wages. Instead of celebrating the rare, quote-unquote, rebel CEOs, Bob's Red Mill may be off your radar, but it's an example of what more enlightened leadership can accomplish. Why not create a pipeline of such leaders? Compete against the failed model.
Well, you make a good point. The business schools are really finishing schools increasingly for hedge funds, for Goldman Sachs type jobs. They aren't going much into manufacturing and innovating the production of real things. They're very attracted to Silicon Valley companies, which really don't produce anything that can be called the necessities of life, or even the precursors to the necessities of life. So you make some good points, Anthony. There is a business school at Yale that deals with training people for public management jobs, like in government, and it has been known to have some enlightened courses. There are business schools who now are revising their curriculum to deal with the subjects of sustainability and renewable energy and climate violence. But by and large, the graduates go to where the most lucrative jobs are. So it doesn't matter what they learn in business school, unless the big endowed universities can provide more alternatives when they get out of business school. They'll just take a few good guy type courses and float into the Goldman Sachs maw for huge salaries. An interesting point you make is alternative business schools. There have been alternative college curriculums like the old Antioch College, but I don't know of any alternative business school singularly dedicated to Other models of business organization, like cooperatives or mutual firms or worker-owned firms, or business schools that define business as including consumers, not just sellers, define business as including public investment and shareholder power, which of course would expose the stock buyback racket, which is devouring the profits that come from consumer sales by big business corporations that don't produce any job, don't help any pension, don't raise any wages, don't create any research and development. They just buy back company stock without shareholder approval in order to raise the metrics for executive compensation packages for the bosses at the top. $8 trillion in the last 10 years. U.S. corporations have bought back their stock. It used to be a violation of the SEC regulation against insider manipulative stock trading. But Reagan changed that and allowed it to happen. And the results for corporate productive investments has been disastrous since that change at the SEC. And we are about to petition the SEC to revoke that rule, allowing unbridled stock buybacks, and make the corporations either give it back to the shareholders, mutual funds, pension funds, or find ways to invest it in productive job-producing activities.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we welcome Stephen Donziger, who tells us of how Chevron, combined with a corporate-friendly judiciary, managed to place him under house arrest. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting